In the heart of the Colorado wilderness, Mike Stevens knew every mile of the isolated Highway 36. 30 years behind the wheel had taught him to expect the unexpected. But when his trusted truck gave out beneath a bleak winter sky, veteran trucker Mike finds himself stranded on a remote highway amid an oncoming winter wildfire, an unprecedented danger fueled by strange weather patterns. Alone, with a dead phone and the memory of his late wife, Mike prepares for the worst. But nothing could have prepared him for what emerged from the shadowy forest that day. A mother bobcat, 4 tiny cubs, and a desperate urgency in those amber eyes that defied everything we thought we know about the wilderness. Mike faced an impossible choice: trust his instincts as a seasoned survivalist, or follow a wild predator leading her family away from danger. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories.
The ancient diesel engine of Mike Stevens' Peterbilt groaned beneath the crushing Colorado cold. At 53, with 30 years of long-haul driving under his belt, Mike had seen nearly every challenge the road could throw at a man. The treacherous, ice-slicked highways of the Northern Territories in winter were nothing new to him. But something about today's run felt different. Maybe it was the unusual weather pattern the meteorologist had mentioned that morning at the truck stop in Boulder. Unseasonably warm temperatures followed by a precipitous drop, creating dangerous conditions for wildfires despite the winter season. Maybe it was the eerie quiet on the CB radio, normally filled with the chatter of fellow drivers navigating the remote stretches of Highway 36. Or maybe it was simply the gnawing loneliness that had become Mike's constant companion since Marion's passing 3 years ago. As the truck labored up a steep incline, Mike glanced at the small wooden box secured to his dashboard with industrial-strength Velcro. Inside were Marion's ashes, or at least a small portion of them. "Just another day in paradise, right, sweetheart?" he murmured, a ritual that had become as natural as checking his mirrors. The first sign of trouble came with a subtle change in the engine's pitch, a discordant note that only someone who had spent decades listening to the same mechanical symphony would notice. Mike frowned, tapping the temperature gauge with a calloused finger. The needle hovered dangerously close to the red zone. "Come on, old girl." He coaxed the truck, downshifting to reduce the strain. Just 20 more miles to the maintenance station. But the Peterbilt had other ideas. The engine coughed once, twice, then gave a violent shudder. Black smoke began billowing from beneath the hood, and the steering grew heavy in Mike's hands. With practiced calm, he guided the massive vehicle to the side of the desolate highway, the snow-covered pines standing sentinel as the truck shuddered to a final, ominous stop. Silence descended, broken only by the soft tick-tick-tick of the cooling engine. Mike exhaled slowly, his breath forming a cloud in the cab that was already growing colder by the minute. He reached for his satellite phone, mentally calculating how long it would take for roadside assistance to reach him this far out. The screen remained dark when he pressed the power button. He tried again, holding it longer, but nothing happened. With a sinking feeling, Mike remembered he'd meant to charge it at his last stop. Between the cold and the battery's age, it had likely drained faster than usual. "Perfect," he muttered, sliding his heavy coat on and shoving his hands into thermal gloves. Just perfect. Outside, the temperature hit him like a physical blow. The thermometer on his truck's side mirror read 15 below zero, and that didn't account for the wind chill that sliced through layers of clothing like a knife. Mike trudged around to the hood, unlatching it and wincing at the cloud of acrid smoke that greeted him. Even with his limited mechanical knowledge, he could see this wasn't a quick fix. A cracked radiator hose had sprayed coolant across the engine block, and in these temperatures, the remaining fluid was already beginning to freeze. Mike mentally inventoried his supplies. He had emergency rations, a sleeping bag rated for extreme temperatures, flares, and enough fuel to keep the cab's heater running intermittently for perhaps 2 days if he was careful. People knew his route. When he didn't check in at the next station, someone would eventually come looking. But in weather like this, with night approaching, that was small comfort. As he contemplated his options, a movement in the nearby tree line caught his eye. He froze, suddenly aware of how vulnerable he was. While bears would be hibernating this time of year, wolves and other predators certainly weren't. What emerged from the shadowy forest, however, wasn't the gray form of a timber wolf but the tawny, spotted coat of a bobcat. Even from this distance, Mike could tell it was a female, smaller than a male would be, with a lean, powerful body perfectly adapted to the harsh northern environment. And she wasn't alone. Behind her, partially concealed by the underbrush, for tiny shapes moved tentatively, their spotted coats nearly invisible against the snow-dusted forest floor. "Well, I'll be," Mike whispered, remaining motionless. In all his years driving these routes, he'd caught only fleeting glimpses of these elusive predators. To see a mother with cubs, and in winter, no less, was extraordinary. What happened next defied everything Mike thought he knew about wild animals. Instead of retreating deeper into the protective cover of the forest, the mother bobcat began moving closer to the truck, her movements cautious but deliberate. She stopped about 20 yards away, her amber eyes fixed intently on Mike. Then she made a sound, not the snarl or hiss he might have expected, but a chirping, yowling call that seemed almost conversational. The cubs huddled together at the forest's edge, occasionally mimicking their mother's calls in higher-pitched voices, their tiny faces turned anxiously toward the horizon behind them. Mike remained perfectly still, scarcely breathing. The bobcat paced in a tight circle, her agitation visibly growing. She looked repeatedly between Mike and the distant forest to the west, then repeated her strange, urgent call. "What's got you so worked up, Mama?" Mike murmured, careful not to make any sudden movements. The bobcat's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but she didn't retreat. If anything, her movements became more insistent, her calls louder. That's when Mike noticed the smell, not the sharp chemical scent of his truck's coolant, but something more ominous. Smoke. And not the thin, white smoke of a campfire, but the thick, acrid smell of a major burn. He turned toward the western horizon and felt his blood run cold. In the distance, behind a ridge of hills, a dark wall of smoke was rising, staining the pale winter sky. Beneath it, Mike could just make out the orange glow of flames. A forest fire, in winter. Unusual but not impossible, especially with the dry spell they'd had and the high winds forecasted for the evening. The fire would be moving fast, feeding on the drought-stressed timber and driven by the gusting wind directly toward the highway, toward him. Panic surged through Mike's body, sending a rush of adrenaline into his limbs. He needed to move, now. But where? The maintenance station was too far to reach on foot before the fire arrived, especially in these temperatures. The surrounding landscape offered little in the way of natural fire breaks, just miles of dense forest and rugged terrain. As he quickly gathered essential supplies from his truck, shoving them into his emergency backpack, the bobcat let out another call, louder, more insistent. Mike looked up to see her herding her cubs toward a narrow game trail that led away from the approaching fire, perpendicular to the highway. She moved several yards down the path, then stopped and looked back directly at Mike. She waited, her eyes locked on his, then moved a few more yards and paused again. "You've got to be kidding me," Mike said aloud. The bobcat repeated the process, moving forward, stopping, looking back with that same intense gaze. One of the cubs began to stray from the path, and she quickly guided it back with gentle nudges from her nose, all while keeping Mike in her sight. The smoke was growing thicker now, the wind carrying it toward them in ominous dark clouds. Time was running out. Mike had heard stories of animals sensing danger before humans could, elephants moving to higher ground before tsunamis. dogs alerting families to gas leaks or fires. But this felt like something else entirely, something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the divide between human and animal consciousness. With one last glance at his disabled truck, his livelihood, his home on the road, Mike made his decision. He secured his backpack, grabbed the small wooden box from the dashboard, and began following the Bobcat family down the narrow trail. "I hope you know where you're going, Mama," he said, his voice nearly lost in the rising wind. The path quickly narrowed, winding through densely packed spruce trees and over rocky, uneven ground. The Bobcat moved with effortless grace, her powerful hind legs propelling her over obstacles while her cubs scrambled to keep pace. Mike struggled behind them, his heavy boots slipping on icy patches, his breath coming in ragged gasps that froze instantly in his beard. Behind them, the fire's advance was audible now, a distant but growing roar, punctuated by the explosive cracking of trees as their sap boiled and burst from within. Mike knew all too well how quickly a forest fire could move with the wind behind it. 60, 70 miles an hour wasn't unheard of. They needed to find shelter, and soon. The Bobcat family led him over a frozen creek, the ice cracking ominously beneath his weight, though it held firm under the cat's lighter bodies. They traversed narrow gullies where the wind howled like a living thing, funneled between rocky walls. All the while, the mother Bobcat kept her pattern, moving ahead, stopping to check on her cubs, waiting for Mike to catch up, her strange calls seeming to encourage them all forward. Hours passed, the short winter day fading quickly to twilight. Mike's muscles screamed with exhaustion, his lungs burning from both exertion and the increasingly smoke-filled air. The ash began to fall around them like gray snow, coating their shoulders and stinging their eyes. Several times, he nearly lost sight of the Bobcats in the growing darkness, their natural camouflage making them ghostly shadows against the dimming landscape. Just as Mike felt he couldn't take another step, the forest began to thin. The Bobcat paused at the edge of a small clearing, her tail twitching as she surveyed what lay ahead. Mike stumbled to a stop behind her, leaning heavily against a tree trunk as he struggled to catch his breath. Through the haze of smoke and gathering darkness, a structure took shape on a ridge about half a mile ahead. The angular, human-made lines unmistakable against the natural curves of the landscape. A building of some kind, long abandoned by the look of it, but solid, its metal roof reflecting the ominous orange glow of the approaching fire. "Is that what you've been leading me to?" Mike asked incredulously. The Bobcat looked back at him, her amber eyes reflecting the falling night, then continued forward across the clearing, her cubs close behind. As they drew nearer, Mike recognized the structure as an old ranger station, one of many that had been built across Colorado's vast wilderness decades ago, before budget cuts had forced the Forestry Service to consolidate their operations. Most had been abandoned, left to slowly surrender to the elements. But this one appeared largely intact, its metal construction more resistant to decay than the wooden cabins that had once been common. The mother Bobcat led them straight to the door, then stopped, looking expectantly at Mike. Even in his exhausted, smoke-addled state, he couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it. A wild predator, effectively bringing him to a doorstep like some bizarre wilderness guide. "I'll take it from here, Mama," he said, moving past her to examine the entrance. The door was secured with a heavy padlock, but years of exposure had weakened the hasp. After a few solid hits with a rock, the rusty metal gave way, and the door swung open with a protesting groan. Inside, it was dark and cold, but blessedly free of smoke. The station consisted of a single room with basic amenities, a desk, a wood stove, shelves stocked with ancient canned goods, and a cot with a bare mattress. Most importantly, Mike spotted a radio system on the desk and, next to it, a bright orange box labeled Emergency Beacon. His heart leaped. If the beacon was still functional, It would transmit his location to the nearest search and rescue station. He triggered the device, which responded with a reassuring series of beeps and a flashing red light. Then he collapsed onto the cot, his legs finally giving out beneath him. Through the grimy window, he could see the Bobcat family settling into the tall grass and brush just outside the cabin, the cubs curling against their mother's warm body while she remained alert, her eyes scanning the darkness. "Thank you," Mike whispered, though he knew the words were inadequate for what had just occurred. The night passed in a blur of exhaustion and anxiety. The fire came close enough that Mike could feel the heat radiating through the station's metal walls, but a providential shift in the wind spared them from a direct hit. By dawn, the immediate danger had passed, though smoke still hung heavy in the air, and the distant ridges glowed with pockets of flame. Mike awoke to the sound of rotors, the distinctive whomp 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 of a rescue helicopter approaching. He stumbled outside, waving frantically as the aircraft circled once, then descended to a small clearing about 100 yards from the station. Two rescuers in bright orange jumpsuits approached, their expressions shifting from professional concern to astonishment as they took in not only Mike's presence, but also the Bobcat family still resting nearby. The mother raised her head alertly at the newcomers, but made no move to flee. "Sir, are you Mike Stevens?" one rescuer shouted over the helicopter's noise. Mike nodded, his voice too hoarse from smoke to respond properly. "We picked up the emergency beacon. Your trucking company reported you missing when you didn't check in yesterday. Are you injured?" Mike shook his head, then gestured toward the Bobcats. They led me here," he managed to croak. The rescuers exchanged skeptical glances. "Sir, you're probably suffering from smoke inhalation and exposure," the second rescuer said gently. "Let's get you to the hospital, and you can explain everything there." As they helped Mike toward the helicopter, he turned for one last look at his unlikely saviors. The mother Bobcat was standing now, her cubs clustered behind her, watching the humans with those same intelligent, amber eyes. Mike raised his hand in a small wave. Just before he turned away, he could have sworn the Bobcat dipped her head in acknowledgement. The doctors kept Mike in Boulder Community Hospital for 3 days, treating him for moderate smoke inhalation, exposure, and dehydration. When he recounted his experience to the wildlife officials who came to interview him, he could see the skepticism in their expressions. While bobcats are native to Colorado, they're extremely secretive animals, one biologist explained patiently. What you're describing, leading a human to safety, contradicts everything we know about their behavior. It's more likely that they were simply fleeing the fire along the same path you chose. For 8 miles, Mike challenged, stopping every few minutes to check if I was following, leading me directly to a ranger station with a working emergency beacon. The biologist offered a sympathetic smile. "The human mind is remarkable at finding patterns, Mr. Stevens, especially in crisis situations. You were oxygen-deprived, frightened, and disoriented. It's natural to interpret random animal behavior as purposeful, especially when it aligns with a positive outcome." Mike gave up trying to convince them. He knew what he had experienced, regardless of whether it fit into their scientific understanding of animal behavior or not. His truck was a total loss, not from the fire, which had spared the highway, but from a fallen tree that had crushed the cab as the fire created its own weather system, generating powerful, erratic winds. The insurance would cover most of it, but Mike would be off the road for at least a month while the paperwork processed and a replacement vehicle was sourced. In the meantime, he found himself drawn back to the area around the ranger station. Not to the station itself, which had been resecured by forestry officials, but to the surrounding wilderness that had partially survived the fire's devastation. Something about the experience had awakened a long-dormant part of him, a connection to the natural world that had been buried beneath decades of highways, deadlines, and the artificial rhythm of life on the road. 2 weeks after his rescue, Mike hired a local guide to take him into the backcountry near where his encounter had occurred. The guide, a Ute man named Joe with deep lines etched into his weathered face, listened to Mike's story without the dismissive skepticism the wildlife officials had shown. "Our people have stories," Joe said simply as they hiked through a landscape of charred trees and new growth already pushing through the ash-covered ground. "Stories of animals who assist humans, who communicate between worlds. Your scientists call these stories myths, but we know them as truth." They made camp that evening on a ridge overlooking the valley where the fire had swept through. As the stars emerged in the clear Colorado sky, Joe brewed strong coffee over their small fire and shared more of his people's traditional knowledge about the interconnectedness of all living things. "The bobcat is not common in our stories. That honor usually goes to raven, bear, or wolf," he explained. "But all animals have spirit, have knowing. Perhaps this mother recognized something in you, a shared vulnerability, a mutual need that transcended the usual boundaries." Mike thought about that as he stared into the flames. He had been vulnerable out there, certainly, but so had the bobcat family. In leading him to safety, the mother had slowed her own escape, potentially putting her cubs at risk. That went beyond mere instinct. It suggested a capacity for something more, compassion, perhaps, or at least a recognition of another being's peril that transcended species boundaries. The following morning, they rose before dawn and continued their hike along a rocky ridge that had been largely spared by the fire. Joe moved with the quiet confidence of someone intimately familiar with the land, pointing out subtle signs of wildlife returning to the burn zone. Tracks in the soft ash, new shoots being nibbled by returning herbivores, the distant calls of birds reclaiming their territory. As they rounded a granite outcropping, Joe suddenly froze, one hand raised for silence. He pointed to a sheltered hollow about 50 yards away, where sunlight dappled through the remaining trees. There, nearly invisible against the mottled ground, was a bobcat, a female, her tawny coat marked with the distinctive spots and her ear tufts alertly raised. Beside her, her cubs played in the morning light, their movements still carrying the awkward exuberance of youth despite their growing size. Mike's breath caught in his throat. It was impossible to know for certain if this was the same family. Bobcats all shared similar markings, but something in the mother's watchful posture, the particular arrangement of darker spots across her face, convinced him it was her. "Don't move," Joe whispered. "This is a gift." For several minutes, they stood in perfect stillness, watching the family go about their morning routine. The cubs wrestled and pounced on one another while their mother groomed herself, occasionally glancing up to monitor their antics with patient tolerance. Then, as if sensing their presence, the mother bobcat looked directly toward their position. Even at this distance, Mike felt the uncanny intelligence in that gaze, the same knowing awareness he'd experienced during their shared journey through the fire. The bobcat rose, stretched leisurely, then gathered her cubs with a series of soft chirps. Instead of retreating, however, she led them in a deliberate path that took them across an open space about 30 yards from where Mike and Joe stood. She paused there, looking directly at the humans, her cubs milling curiously around her legs. "She's acknowledging you," Joe said, his voice filled with quiet wonder. "This doesn't happen." Mike slowly reached into his pocket and withdrew the small wooden box containing Marion's ashes. He had carried it with him every day since her passing, unable to scatter the remains as she had requested. Something had always held him back, a reluctance to complete that final act of separation, perhaps, or uncertainty about the right location. Now, watching this fierce mother guiding her family through a landscape of both destruction and renewal, Mike suddenly understood what Marion had meant when she'd asked for her ashes to be returned to somewhere that matters. It wasn't about a specific place. It was about a moment of connection, of belonging to something larger than oneself. With trembling fingers, he opened the box. The ashes inside were gray and fine, indistinguishable from the ash that now covered much of the surrounding forest. But these represented something precious, the physical remainder of a love that had shaped his entire adult life. "May I?" he asked Joe, who nodded in solemn understanding. Mike took a small handful of the ashes and released them into the gentle morning breeze. They drifted across the space between him and the Bobcat family, some settling on the new growth already pushing through the charred earth, some carried further into the wilderness beyond. The mother Bobcat watched, unmoving, as Mike performed this ritual. Then, with one final direct look that seemed to penetrate to his very core, she turned and led her cubs back into the shelter of the forest, their forms gradually blending with the dappled shadows until they disappeared entirely. "Thank you," Mike whispered, though whether to the departed Bobcats, to Marion's spirit, or to the land itself, he couldn't have said. 6 months later, Mike Stevens was back on the road with a new truck, making his regular run along Highway 36. The spring thaw was well underway, turning the world from white to a vibrant green as life reclaimed the burned areas of the forest. Things were different now. He'd made changes, small but significant. He took more breaks, spent more time observing the wilderness around him rather than just passing through it. He'd started keeping a journal of wildlife sightings, developing a more attentive relationship with the land he had traversed for decades but rarely truly seen. And on his dashboard, next to his GPS, sat 2 photographs. One was of Marion, laughing by a mountain lake on their 20th anniversary. The other was a blurry image captured on Joe's camera during their hike, a tawny shape with 4 smaller forms beside it, just visible among the trees, a family of wild creatures that had, for one extraordinary moment, breached the ancient divide between their world and his. The stretch of Highway 36 where Mike had broken down now had a new, unofficial name among the local drivers, Guardian's Pass. The story had spread, as stories do in tight-knit communities, gaining embellishments with each retelling until it had become something of a modern legend. Most dismissed it as trucker folklore, of course, just another tall tale to pass the long, lonely miles. But occasionally, drivers reported unusual sightings along that remote stretch of road. A bobcat standing boldly by the roadside, watching the trucks pass with unusual intensity. Small, spotted forms darting across the road in what almost appeared to be an orchestrated procession. Strange calls echoing through the trees that didn't quite match any known predator's voice. Mike listened to these stories on the CB radio with a private smile. Some mysteries weren't meant to be explained or proven to others' satisfaction. Some experiences existed in that liminal space between the scientifically verifiable and the personally undeniable. As he guided his truck around a bend in the highway, a flash of movement caught his eye, a tawny form slipping between the trees, there and gone in an instant. Mike slowed the truck, scanning the tree line. There was nothing there, of course, just shadows and the wind moving through new spring growth. But Mike smiled anyway and tapped the photograph on his dashboard. "Still looking out for me, Mama?" he asked the empty cab. "I see you too." And he drove on through the wilderness, a man forever changed by a single act of connection that had transcended the boundaries between species. A moment of profound recognition between 2 mothers, one human and long departed, one wild and fiercely present, both understanding the essential truth at the heart of all life, that in our vulnerability, in our love for those who depend on us, we are far more alike than different.
The cat mysteriously disappeared before his owner's death. But when he showed up at the funeral, everyone was stunned. The town of Meadowbrook lay nestled in a gentle valley, a quiet tapestry of neat houses, established trees, and the slow, unhurried rhythm of lives lived largely out of the spotlight. People knew their neighbors, at least casually, exchanged pleasantries at the post office, and gathered for the annual Founders' Day picnic. But like any place, it had its quiet corners, its solitary figures who existed on the periphery of the town's gentle hum. Silas Abernathy had been one such figure. He lived alone in a small, tidy but worn clapboard house on Oak Street, a house that stood mostly silent behind drawn curtains. Silas had been a widower for longer than many residents had lived in Meadowbrook, and his children, if he had any, lived far away and rarely, if ever, visited. He was a man of routine, a morning walk to fetch the newspaper, tending to his small vegetable garden in the back, a solitary figure seen occasionally at the grocery store, nodding politely but rarely engaging in lengthy conversation. He wasn't unfriendly, neighbors would say, just quiet, reserved, lost in his own world. So, when news circulated that Silas Abernathy had passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 81, the reaction was one of quiet, respectful sadness, but perhaps not deep, personal grief for most. He had simply faded out, much as he had lived. The funeral was arranged at the small Meadowbrook Community Church, followed by burial in the adjacent cemetery. Reverend Miller expected a small turnout, and he was right. On a Tuesday morning, under a sky the color of pewter, only a handful of people gathered in the polished wooden pews. There was Mildred Peterson, who lived next door to Silas and sometimes exchanged gardening tips with him over the fence. There was Eleanor Gable from across the street, a kind-hearted woman in her late 50s who always made a point to wave if she saw Silas outside. Mr. Henderson, the postman who delivered Silas's mail for 20 years, sat near the back. A few other neighbors, faces etched with polite solemnity, completed the small congregation. It felt sparse, a quiet testament to a life lived largely alone. Reverend Miller began the service, his voice calm and measured, speaking of community, of peace, of the quiet dignity with which Silas Abernathy had lived his life in their town. He spoke from the standard scriptures, acknowledging that while Silas had kept mostly to himself, he was part of the fabric of Meadowbrook, and his passing left a space, however quiet. The air in the church was still, filled only with the minister's voice and the faint scent of old wood and hymnals. It was, by all accounts, proceeding as expected. A simple, unremarkable farewell for a simple, unremarkable man. Until the cat arrived. He appeared as if from nowhere, a medium-sized orange tabby cat, lean but not starved, with fur the color of marmalade and bright, intelligent green eyes. He trotted purposefully down the center aisle of the small church, his paws making no sound on the worn runner. Heads turned, quiet murmurs rippled through the sparse congregation. A cat? In church? The cat ignored the surprised stares. His attention was fixed solely on the simple wooden coffin resting on a bier at the front of the church. With an agility that belied any nervousness, he leaped gracefully, not directly onto the coffin itself, but onto the bier beside it. From there, he reached out a tentative paw, touching the polished wood almost reverently. Then he sat, perfectly still, eyes fixed on the coffin, letting out a soft, low, mournful cry, a sound that resonated in the quiet church, cutting straight to the heart. Reverend Miller paused, momentarily taken aback. Mr. Henderson coughed awkwardly. Eleanor Gable gasped softly. Someone, perhaps one of the ushers, took a step forward, intending to gently shoo the creature away. But the cat merely turned his head, gave the approaching man a steady, unblinking look, not hostile, but utterly determined, and then turned back to the coffin, letting out another plaintive meow. The usher hesitated, then retreated. There was something in the cat's demeanor, a palpable sense of purpose, of belonging, that made forcibly removing him feel wrong. Reverend Miller, recovering his composure, decided to proceed, incorporating the unexpected guest into the fabric of the moment. Even the creatures of the field, or perhaps the hearth, seemed to recognize a gentle soul. He improvised softly, his gaze resting briefly on the cat before returning to his notes. The cat remained there throughout the rest of the short service. He didn't fidget or make noise, other than the occasional soft, heart-wrenching cry. He simply sat watch, a small, furry orange sentinel, beside the coffin of Silas Abernathy. When the pallbearers, neighbors volunteering, came forward to carry the coffin out, the cat didn't interfere, but watched intently. As they lifted it, he hopped silently down from the bier and followed closely behind them as they walked slowly down the aisle and out into the gray daylight. Outside, as the coffin was being slid into the waiting hearse, the cat tried to follow, rubbing against the legs of the men, meowing more insistently now. Gently, Mr. Henderson picked him up. The cat struggled briefly, not scratching, but desperate to get back to the coffin. "Easy there, fella," Mr. Henderson murmured, holding the surprisingly solid cat. "Where did you come from?" No one had an answer. He wasn't a known stray in the immediate neighborhood. His appearance, his focused grief, was a mystery. As the hearse pulled away towards the cemetery gates, the cat squirmed out of Mr. Henderson's grasp, landed silently on the ground, and without hesitation began trotting determinedly down the road, following the path the hearse had taken. The small group of mourners looked at each other, bewildered and strangely moved. This quiet funeral had suddenly become anything but ordinary. The graveside service was brief, the gray sky threatening a drizzle that never quite materialized. The small group huddled around the open plot, listening to Reverend Miller's final prayers and the committal. As the simple wooden coffin was lowered into the earth, a flash of orange appeared at the edge of the gathering. It was the cat. He navigated carefully around the attendees' feet, ignoring their renewed murmurs of surprise, until he reached the edge of the grave. There he sat, his gaze fixed on the coffin as the first shovelfuls of earth began to fall. He didn't flinch at the sound, didn't move. He just watched, his small body tense with an emotion that looked undeniably like grief. Once the grave was filled and the temporary marker placed, the neighbors began to disperse, exchanging quiet words, heading back to their cars. But the orange cat remained. He walked onto the freshly turned earth, sniffed at the base of the marker, and then lay down, curling his body against the mound, his head resting on his paws, facing the direction of the buried coffin. He closed his eyes, but his body remained alert, a silent, unmoving declaration that he was not leaving. Eleanor Gable lingered, watching the cat, her heart aching with a confusing mix of pity and wonder. Mildred Peterson, Silas's next-door neighbor, came to stand beside her. "Would you look at that?" Mildred said softly, her voice filled with awe. "It is him. It's Sonny." "Sonny?" Eleanor asked. "You know this cat, Mildred?" Mildred nodded, her eyes also fixed on the small orange form. Oh yes, that's Silas's cat. Or he was Silas's cat. She proceeded to tell Eleanor the story, her voice low. Silas found him years ago. Must be 8, maybe 9 years now. There was a terrible thunderstorm one night, wind howling, rain coming down in sheets. Silas heard this pitiful crying from his back porch. He went out with a flashlight, and there, huddled under the eaves, soaked and shivering, was a tiny little orange kitten, no bigger than his hand. Abandoned, likely. Silas, bless his quiet heart, couldn't leave him there. He brought him inside, dried him off, warmed him up with some milk, and that was that. The kitten never left, and Silas never made him leave. Named him Sonny, he did. Said the little fella brought a bit of sunshine into his quiet house. Mildred sighed. Those two were inseparable. You'd see Silas working in his garden, and Sonny would be right there, lounging in a patch of sun or batting at weeds. When Silas sat on his porch swing in the evenings, Sonny would be curled up beside him. Silas talked to that cat, you know. I'd hear him sometimes over the fence, just quiet chatter, telling Sonny about his day. That cat was his constant companion, his shadow. Eleanor listened, picturing the solitary Mr. Abernathy finding companionship with the stray kitten. It cast him in a different light. But then, Mildred continued, her brow furrowing, about a month ago, maybe 5 weeks, Sonny disappeared, just vanished. Silas was distraught, absolutely beside himself. He walked all over the neighborhood calling for him, put up little handwritten signs on lampposts, asked me and everyone else if we'd seen him. He was just heartbroken. We all kept an eye out, but Sonny was nowhere to be found. Silas, well, he seemed to decline after that. He stopped sitting on his porch, didn't tend his garden much. He looked older, sadder. I think losing Sonny hit him harder than any of us realized. And now, here Sonny is, on the day Silas is laid to rest. Mildred shook her head slowly. It's like he knew, like he came back to say goodbye. Eleanor looked at the cat lying faithfully on the grave, understanding dawning in her heart. This wasn't just a random stray behaving strangely. This was a beloved companion, mourning the loss of his person, returned too late, keeping a final lonely vigil. The sight was almost unbearable in its poignancy. The other neighbors eventually drifted away, leaving only Eleanor, Mildred, and Reverend Miller standing near the cemetery gate, looking back at the solitary orange cat, keeping watch over Silas Abernathy's grave. The gray sky seemed to press down, amplifying the sense of quiet sorrow. What will happen to him? Eleanor asked softly, voicing the question lingering in the air. Hard to say, Reverend Miller replied, adjusting his collar. He seems quite devoted. Might just stay there. He can't stay here, Mildred said practically, though her voice was gentle. He needs food, shelter, especially if he's been lost for a month, poor thing. Eleanor felt a pull, a sense of responsibility stirring within her. She thought of Silas, living so quietly, his world apparently revolving around this little creature who had shown up so unexpectedly at his end. She thought of the cat's unwavering loyalty, lying there on the cold earth. It felt fundamentally wrong to just walk away and leave him. Maybe, Eleanor began hesitantly, maybe I could take him, just for now, see if he'll come with me? Mildred looked at her, relief softening her worried expression. "Oh, Eleanor, that would be wonderful. I'd offer, but my old tomcat wouldn't stand for another feline in the house." Reverend Miller nodded approvingly. "A kind gesture, Mrs. Gable, a very kind gesture indeed." Steeling herself, Eleanor walked slowly back towards the grave. Sonny lifted his head as she approached, his green eyes watching her warily. He didn't hiss or bolt, but he didn't invite contact either. Eleanor crouched down a few feet away, careful not to loom over him. "Hello, Sonny," she said softly, using the name Mildred had supplied. "Mr. Abernathy is at peace now. You don't need to stay out here in the cold." The cat just stared at her, unmoving. "Come on, boy," she coaxed gently. "It's all right. You must be hungry. How about we get you something warm?" She extended her hand slowly, palm down. Sonny watched it, then briefly, tentatively, sniffed her fingers before drawing back slightly. It wasn't rejection, but caution. Eleanor sat down quietly on the grass near the grave, not pushing, just being present. She talked to him in a low, soothing voice, telling him about Silas, how much he must have loved him, how sad he was when Sonny disappeared. She didn't know if the cat understood her words, but perhaps he understood the gentle tone, the lack of threat. After several long minutes, Sonny shifted. He stood up, stretched languidly, and then, to Eleanor's surprise, walked over and rubbed briefly against her outstretched hand before turning back to look at the grave mound one last time. He let out a single, soft meow, then looked back at Eleanor as if asking a question or giving consent. "Okay," Eleanor whispered, her throat tight. "Let's go then." She stood up slowly. Sonny hesitated for only a moment before falling into step beside her as she walked away from the grave, away from the cemetery. Mildred and the Reverend watched them go, a shared look of quiet gratitude passing between them. Eleanor hadn't fully thought through the logistics. She lived alone herself, her own children grown and gone. She had a quiet house. Could she take on a cat, especially one grieving and possibly traumatized from being lost? But as Sonny trotted trustingly beside her, occasionally looking up at her face, she knew she had to try. She had agreed earlier to help Mildred sort through some of Silas's immediate belongings, decide what needed to be kept or donated. Perhaps, she thought, taking Sonny back to his familiar surroundings first might be the best approach. She headed towards Oak Street, towards the silent, empty house of Silas Abernathy, with his loyal companion now walking quietly by her side. The key Mildred had given her turned stiffly in the lock of Silas Abernathy's front door. Pushing it open, Eleanor stepped into the stillness of the house, Sonny immediately slipping past her ankles. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of dust, old wood, and something else, a faint, lingering scent that might have been Silas himself. The house was sparsely furnished, but impeccably neat. Old, comfortable chairs, polished side tables, a shelf filled with well-read books. It spoke of a life lived with quiet order, but also profound solitude. Eleanor felt a pang of sadness looking around the silent rooms. Sonny seemed hesitant at first. He stood in the center of the small living room, looking around, sniffing the air, his tail held low. He walked slowly into the kitchen, looked at the empty food and water bowls placed neatly by the back door, and let out a soft, questioning meow. "I know, boy. Eleanor murmured, finding some dry cat food Mildred had given her from her own supply and filling the bowl. Things are different now. Sonny ate cautiously, not ravenously, but steadily. While he ate, Eleanor looked around the living room more closely. It was a simple room, dominated by a large, comfortable-looking armchair positioned near a window overlooking the garden. A reading lamp stood beside it, along with a small table holding a pair of spectacles and a well-worn book. This was clearly Silas's spot. Her eyes scanned the room, noting the few framed pictures on the mantelpiece. A faded photo of a smiling woman, presumably his late wife, another of a scenic landscape. Then she noticed it, tucked away in a dusty corner, partially hidden behind a stack of old newspapers, was a small, dark wooden box. It wasn't particularly ornate, just a simple, hinged box, perhaps a foot square, dark with age. As soon as Sonny finished eating, he seemed drawn to that corner. He walked over to the wooden box, sniffed it intently, and then sat down directly in front of it, staring at it with unwavering focus. He let out another soft meow, this one directed clearly at the box. Eleanor watched him, puzzled. "What is it, Sonny? What's in there?" The cat just blinked slowly, then reached out a paw and gently batted at the lid of the box. He looked back at Eleanor, then back at the box, meowing again, more insistently this time. It was clear he wanted her attention focused on this specific object. Mildred hadn't mentioned any particular valuables or family heirlooms Silas might have kept. This box looked old, forgotten, but Sonny's peculiar insistence intrigued Eleanor. Why was he so focused on this particular box? Had Silas often stored treats in it? Or was there something else? Wiping her dusty hands on her slacks, Eleanor knelt beside the cat. All right, I see it," she said. Sonny rubbed against her arm, purring faintly for the first time since she'd met him, his eyes still on the box. Eleanor reached out and touched the lid. It was smooth, but slightly gritty with dust. There was no lock, just a simple brass clasp, tarnished green with age. With Sonny watching intently beside her, she carefully lifted the clasp. It opened with a faint click. Hesitantly, she raised the lid, wondering what secret Silas Abernathy's quiet life might hold inside this forgotten container. The inside of the box was lined with faded blue velvet, now slightly musty. Nestled within were not valuables in the traditional sense, but treasures of a different kind. At the top lay a small stack of photographs held together by a crumbling rubber band. Eleanor carefully lifted them out. They were mostly pictures of Sonny. Sonny as a tiny, fluffy kitten batting at a piece of string. Sonny curled up asleep in the big armchair, bathed in sunlight. Sonny sitting proudly beside rows of tomatoes in the garden. In a few precious shots, Silas Abernathy himself appeared, holding the cat. He wasn't smiling broadly, but there was a softness in his eyes, a gentle curve to his lips that Eleanor hadn't seen in the solitary man she occasionally waved to. He looked content, happy even. These photos chronicled a quiet life made brighter by the presence of his feline friend. Beneath the photos lay a small sealed envelope. It was addressed simply in Silas's neat, slightly shaky handwriting, "To whom it may concern." It looked like an unsent letter. With trembling fingers, Eleanor carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of folded paper. She unfolded it and began to read. To whom it may concern, if you are reading this, it likely means I am gone, and perhaps you are sorting through my few belongings. There isn't much monetary value. My life has been a quiet one since Martha passed. But I write this because there is one thing, one being, who has meant the world to me in these later years. That is my cat, Sonny. He came to me on a stormy night, a little scrap of life, and he brought warmth back into this quiet house. He has been my most loyal companion, my confidant, my shadow. He listened patiently to my ramblings, curled up beside me through long evenings, and greeted me each morning with a cheerful chirp. In truth, he has been my family when I had none left nearby. Recently, Sonny disappeared. I have searched everywhere and called for him until my voice grew hoarse. The silence in this house without him is heavier than I ever thought possible. My health, I fear, is failing, and my deepest regret is not knowing what became of my little friend and not being able to thank him for the joy he brought me. Perhaps it is foolish hope, but if, by some miracle, Sonny should ever find his way back to this house after I am gone, I ask, I beg, whoever finds this letter to show him kindness. Please take care of him the way I tried to. Make sure he has food, a warm place to sleep, a gentle hand. He is a good cat, full of affection once he trusts you. He asks for little, but gives so much. He was not just a pet. He was the heart of my home in these final years. Please don't let him be alone again. Thank you, Silas Abernathy. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face as she finished reading. The simple, heartfelt words painted a vivid picture of the deep bond between the solitary old man and his beloved cat. The letter wasn't just instructions. It was a love letter, a final testament to a relationship that had sustained him. It explained Sonny's profound grief, his determination to be near Silas one last time, his strange insistence on revealing this box. It was as if he knew Silas's last wish was contained within. Eleanor looked down at Sonny, who had crawled into her lap as she read, purring more steadily now, his head resting against her arm. She gently stroked his soft fur, her heart overflowing with emotion. "Oh, Sonny," she whispered, her voice thick, "he loved you so much, so very much." There was no question in her mind anymore. Sonny wouldn't be going to a shelter, nor would he be just a temporary guest. He had a home here with her. She would honor Silas Abernathy's last wish. She would give Sonny the safe, loving home he deserved, the kind of home he had clearly provided for Silas. Later that day, after making arrangements with Mildred regarding the rest of Silas's belongings, Eleanor took Sonny back to her own house across the street. She set up a comfortable bed for him near a sunny window, placed food and water bowls in the kitchen, and showed him the litter box. Sonny explored his new surroundings cautiously, but without fear. He rubbed against furniture, sniffed corners, and then, seemingly satisfied, jumped onto the sofa, curled into a ball, and began to purr loudly, a deep, rumbling sound of contentment. Eleanor sat beside him, stroking his warm back, the letter from Silas resting on the table nearby. The quiet house, didn't feel quite so empty anymore. In fulfilling Silas Abernathy's last wish, she had not only saved a grieving cat, but had also found an unexpected companion for herself. Sonny, the loyal friend who had returned to say a final goodbye, had found his way home once more, carrying the legacy of love from one quiet heart to another. The first few days in Eleanor Gable's house were a period of quiet adjustment for both woman and cat. Sonny, while clearly accepting of Eleanor's presence and the comfort she offered, still carried a shadow of his recent past. He explored every nook and cranny of her tidy home, sniffing cautiously at unfamiliar furniture, pausing long moments at closed doors as if wary of being trapped again. Eleanor, noticing this slight hesitance, made sure the doors to rooms he was allowed in remained slightly ajar, offering him reassurance without making a fuss. He spent long hours napping, often choosing the sunniest spot on the living room rug or the soft quilt folded at the foot of Eleanor's bed, a place she hadn't intended for him but hadn't the heart to deny him when he curled up there so trustingly the first night. When awake, he would often sit at the window, not gazing out with the mournful intensity he'd shown at the grave, but with a quiet observation, watching birds at the feeder or leaves skittering across the lawn. Sometimes a particular slant of light or a distant sound would make him pause, a flicker of memory seeming to cross his feline features, before he would shake his head slightly and return to the present. Eleanor found herself adapting her own routines around her new companion. She learned his preferences quickly. He liked his meals served promptly, enjoyed having his chin scratched just so, and disdained the expensive feathered toys she bought, preferring instead a simple, crumpled piece of paper to bat around the kitchen floor. She started talking to him, much as Mildred described Silas doing. At first, it felt a little strange, narrating her day to a cat, but Sonny would often watch her, blinking slowly, occasionally letting out a soft answering chirp or rubbing against her legs, and the silence of her house felt less pronounced, warmer. She kept Silas's letter and a few of the photos in a cherished wooden box on her own mantelpiece. Sometimes, when Sonny was curled nearby, she would pick up a photo showing Silas holding a much younger Sonny. "He looks so happy here with you," she'd murmur, stroking Sonny's back. "You brought him a lot of joy, you know. He wanted you to be happy too." Sonny would often respond with a deep, rumbling purr, as if understanding and accepting the sentiment. Mildred Peterson called regularly, eager for updates. "How's our little miracle cat settling in?" she'd ask. "He's doing wonderfully, Mildred," Eleanor would reply, often smiling as Sonny head-butted her hand, demanding attention. "He's quite the character, very gentle, but he definitely knows what he wants." "Silas spoiled him, that's why," Mildred would chuckle. "Gave that cat anything he fancied. It does my heart good to know he's landed softly with you, Eleanor. Silas would be so relieved." Eleanor shared the contents of Silas's letter with Mildred, who wiped away tears as she listened. The story, in its quiet way, spread gently through the small circle of neighbors who had known Silas. It added another layer to their memory of the reserved man, a layer of deep, private affection and profound loneliness eased by a small orange cat. Sonny, when seen lounging on Eleanor's porch or accompanying her during gentle gardening, was no longer just a stray who had appeared at a funeral. He was Silas Abernathy's beloved companion, fulfilling his final wish. Months turned into seasons. Sonny's tentative nature faded, replaced by a quiet confidence. His grief seemed to lessen, replaced by contentment, though he always remained near Eleanor when she was home, her steadfast shadow, just as he had been Silas's. He still showed no interest in venturing far, staying within the confines of Eleanor's house and fenced backyard, perhaps remembering the fear and confusion of being lost. His brief fear of closed doors vanished as the routine and safety of his new life became ingrained. Eleanor found her own life subtly enriched. The responsibility of caring for Sonny gave her days a gentle structure. His quiet companionship filled spaces she hadn't even realized were empty. Waking up to find him curled at the foot of her bed, listening to his contented purr as she read in the evenings, laughing at his occasional playful antics. These small moments wove themselves into a tapestry of quiet joy. One crisp autumn afternoon, Eleanor found herself near the Meadowbrook Cemetery, visiting the grave of her own late husband. On impulse, she walked over to the section where Silas Abernathy lay buried. A simple headstone now marked the spot, replacing the temporary marker. The grass had grown over the mound, neat and tidy. She stood there for a moment, thinking of the quiet man and his extraordinary cat. "He's doing well, Silas," she whispered to the stillness. "Sonny is happy. He eats well, sleeps in the sun, and purrs loud enough to shake the furniture sometimes. He's good company. Thank you for trusting him, trusting us, to find each other." As she turned to leave, she felt a sense of peace. The sadness of Silas's lonely end was still there, but it was tempered by the knowledge that his final wish had been fulfilled, his legacy of love carried forward in the small, furry form of his beloved companion. Sonny's last watch at the grave had not been an ending, but a transition, a poignant farewell leading to a new beginning, a testament to a bond that even death could not entirely break, now continuing to bring warmth and companionship into the quiet corners of Meadowbrook.